Welcome, and it's very nice to be here, and this has been an exciting project, frankly, because the 18th century is not one that I'm hugely familiar with. I've worked mostly in the 16th century. It's been a big difference. Anyway, what I'd like to do tonight is sort of take us back to 1711, which is the date that Vivaldi published the concertos, some of which we will hear tonight, the so-called Estro Armonico. And then I'm going to talk about some very new research that's been just come out in a dissertation about the women who played the music. This research really challenges much of the received wisdom about Vivaldi and his figlie di coro, or the women in the, who were playing this music. And I'll get to that in a minute. So who would be in the audience? Well, men of all ages. And particularly during the winter months of Carnival, this kind of thing was just absolutely what people loved to listen to. And they would have been wearing masks, which I'll get to in a minute. At least some of the men would have been tourists, and because Venice was one of the most important places on the European tour. And the audience would also have included respectable women, both Venetian and tourists, and they also would have been masked. Venice, in 1711, was a republic. It was governed by a hereditary nobility, and there was no princely court that could set a cultural tone. That was customary in the rest of Europe. It was therefore known as a libertine city, a place to indulge your appetites and enjoy licentious behaviors. It was a place that promoted the free exchange of ideas. It broke down social barriers, fostered innovation of all kinds. It was a place for sexual adventuring, and this is Casanova arrived a few decades after 1711. A place for gambling. People went to public opera houses and private performance spaces to enjoy what was on offer, and there was an intermingling of nobles and commoners, Christians and Jews, men and women, Venetians and foreigners. All of this mixing was made possible by the wearing of masks. Masks protected the dignity of noblemen, particularly those who were down on their luck. It preserved the aura of modesty that was associated with noble women or women of a high class. It made possible the promiscuity that Venice was famous for. I also think it's important to just remind everyone that a concert, like the one we'll hear tonight, was a really sought-after tourist attraction, and that one of the favorite tourist souvenirs that people brought back from Venice in this period were musical scores. If you could get a musical score in Venice, you would impress your friends back in England. A concert in the Ospedale would have attracted a very sophisticated audience that knew how innovative and exciting this music was that we will hear. They thrilled to the virtuoso playing on stringed instruments as well as voices in higher registers, and maybe especially to the seductive power of the music itself and the women performing it. That's the key word, seduction. These ospedali, the institutions that supported this music, grew out of a uniquely Venetian tradition of public charity, supported by the state and supervised by Venetian noblemen. They thought that the protection of vulnerable women and girls was a responsibility of the state, and they conceived these institutions as a way to maintain social stability and reinforce Christian values. There were 4 of them, and they were very large, and they were all designed to help the poor and the indigent. And the Maria della Pietà, where Vivaldi worked, was the only one that was exclusively female. It wasn't a convent, but their administrative structure borrowed many of the ideas about how to organize and control women from the convents that people were very familiar with. The women were protected from men. They were isolated as much as possible. They were supposed to be obedient virgins. That was the understanding. On the other hand, the noblemen on the board of governors of this ospedale also knew that they needed funding to run their organization, and the musical activities of the Ospedale brought them both prestige and power, and even reinforced the city's reputation as a place for music and theater. So let's get back to the concert. Who would have been there? The sophisticated audience would be in place, seated, right? And the musicians would then file in through a back stair, climbing up to a balcony, and in the balcony they would sit down, and they were behind some sort of metal grill. The actual site no longer exists, so we can't reconstruct it in detail. They were dressed simply, and they were not hidden, but they were not easy to see, right? So they weren't on display, which is most women in public in this period, absolutely. If you went into public, you were on display, but they weren't really. And this is where we return to masking, right? In a sense, the iron grill that was hiding the female performers was the architectural equivalent of the mask that was worn by the people in the audience. And I think that's an important way to understand what we're going to experience this evening. So what did they look like? And this is, again, something that's been a little hard to establish because observers were eager to report, especially these tourists, were eager to report back home about what they saw. And in fact, there has been Pat included some good quotes in your program notes about how various people responded to their experience of these women. And Venice had a long history of trying to regulate the clothing of women of all social classes. But we also know that these rules were made to be broken. And the rules in this particular case just whetted the curiosity of the visitors, right, to the concerts. And everyone was really obsessed with what these women actually might have looked like. So they were prepared to pay for the privilege. And what we've discovered is that if you had either plenty of money or plenty of prestige, you could convince the governors of the Ospedale to allow you either to go upstairs to say hello to the performers, like one might do in backstage, or in fact to watch them give a concert either in their own place, or even to have them come to your noble palazzo, whatever it was, and to play there. This was just part of the constant quest for funds that the Ospedale was interested in, because their job was to support the poor and the indigent, and of course that was a worthwhile thing to do. All right, so these women were called the figlie di coro, and filia means a daughter, a coro is a chorus, and so a filia it just suggests membership in a family and sort of subjection to paternal authority. And historians have long thought that these figlie were under the strict control of the male teachers, the maestri, and the assumption is that they couldn't really express their own musical creativity, either as performers or improvisers. And they were often referred to as meek and cloistered, nun-like figures, maybe frustrated women, and who were not allowed to interact with their audiences. Vanessa Tonelli, who has just published this dissertation, has done a lot of research in the records that the governors of the Ospedale have left us. And that research suggests a very, very different story about these women. First of all, many of the performers were probably in their 20s and 30s, and they had absolutely become accomplished musicians and teachers in their own right by the time they were allowed or invited to play in this very exclusive group. Tonelli has written she's produced her research with a very particular project. She wants to restore the voices of the figlie di coro, somehow allow us to hear their voices more than we have been able to in the past. And so I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about what one would go through to become one of these figlie di coro. First of all of the orphans at this particular Ospedale were in fact orphans left as babies, and they were put on a kind of a rotating tray, and you put the baby on the tray, and then you would rotate it and put it into the building, so no one would even see the person or people who left the baby. Sadly, between a half and 3/4 of these babies did not survive. Those that did were sent out to wet nurses in the countryside. If they survived that, they were brought back to the ospedale, and at the age of 6, they began to check and see whether these little girls had musical ability and musical talent, and then they would begin to train them. So, who was training them? Well, because it was a female institution, not going to have men training these young women, and so the people who were teaching music were the advanced music students and advanced musicians who had already been through this process. It was a rigorous training, and it was a lengthy apprenticeship, and it went in phases that were according to calendar age. So you weren't going to have a chance even at playing until you were certainly in your mid-teens and maybe in your 20s. And you might ask, why did they do this? I mean, certainly they did it because they were making money for the overall benefit of the institution, but also because musical training was a very good path to upward mobility for women who did not have otherwise, who might not have had any opportunities. And they could become the wife of a musician, a professional woman. They could become a teacher of music. They could become a performer on a public or private stage. That happened less. Or they could stay at the ospedale. So it was the cream of the crop, and they knew that they would have access to an exciting musical life if they were lucky enough to survive and to be included in this. So the other piece that happens here is that the governors of the ospedale were quite ambitious, musically ambitious themselves, and so they hired the top musicians in Venice to come and teach these young women, which is where Vivaldi fits in, right? He was a very accomplished violinist, he was a young man, and it was kind of logical that he would be invited to join the teaching staff at the ospedale. But if a man were going to be teaching, there would always be a female teacher there too, to supervise. And so I think it's fair, and Tonelli has very much unearthed a sort of a system that looks like conservatory training today, and it was very intensive and very sophisticated. It was very competitive, and part of what they wanted to do was produce musical stars, right? And who would then be announced and play, and then, of course, inspire further donations to the ospedale. They were also, and this is not something that we know that we really knew about until this woman did the research, they were regularly allowed to perform at private events outside the ospedale. Well supervised, of course, and then they could also, and people, could invite them over to hear them play. They could also teach. And then occasionally, and this increasingly happened after 1711, in the middle of the 18th century, young women from outside the institution would actually be allowed to go to the ospedale and study music with some of the female teachers. So it's customary to give Vivaldi most of the credit for the brilliant, innovative ideas that he explores in his instrumental music that we will be hearing tonight. But Tonelli suggests that that's a bit of a misreading of the documents and of the way music was created in the early 18th century. Improvisation, based on a sophisticated understanding of harmony and counterpoint, which of course they all had learned, was a key part of any virtuoso performance. And so her argument essentially is that the figlie di coro, this group of women, that the performance conventions that they were working within, including their location in balconies, which would have been above the audience, as well as their techniques of improvised basso continuo, they would sort of realize the basic that they had, and this Baroque style in ornamentation. You could sort of do what you want, as many of you understand. And also cadenzas, right, were just as influential to the evolution of this music as Vivaldi's written compositions. Now, Maria della Pietà, who is the really, really famous violinist, joined the Figlie di Coro, this group, in 1706. So she had been in Vivaldi's, sort of in his head, her talents and her, brilliance, already for 5 years by the time he published this music. But the point that Tonelli has discovered is, and other historians too, is that there are many more women musicians like Anna Maria who had long and satisfying careers at the Ospedale and also beyond, in various other parts of Venice, and actually other parts of the terraferma and the Venetian state. And the thing that's sort of, upsetting and shocking to me as a historian is how almost all of this music has been lost. So Vivaldi was brilliant, but it's perfectly feasible that there were lots of other brilliant composers who we just don't know about. So Tonelli's research into these documents of the Ospedale, she wants to restore the women to the story of instrumental music in the early 18th century. She wants to restore these voices. And she points out that this was a largely self-governing master-apprentice system, and that Vivaldi was a temporary influence, a link in a long chain of many top music instructors. This group, the Figlie di Coro, they're the ones that sustained the musical instruction at the Ospedale. And Vivaldi, along with many other male music masters, came in and modified this system, but they did come and go, right? And in fact, we do know that Vivaldi himself was responsible for introducing much more instrumental music into the concerts and into the activities of the Figlie, but but vocal music was always given prime of place. Now, Vivaldi himself, his ambitions extended far beyond the Ospedale. And the music that we're going to hear tonight comes from the collection of 12 concertos that he published called the Estro Armonico. And that might translate as a kind of extravagant or fantastic harmony, right? Or it's like invented. It was sort of he was trying to promote himself, and one of the reasons we know he was trying to promote himself is that he actually did not have the collection printed in Venice. He went to a printer outside in Amsterdam, Roger, I don't know how it's pronounced, who was using a brand new way of printing music. He was engraving it and made it much more legible. So, and the players are using actually they're playing from the facsimile of the music that when it was originally published. But the thing that's interesting from the historical point of view is that Vivaldi had a plan. He did not want his music just to stay in Venice. He wanted it to be known to a much broader international audience, and it worked in the sense that Johann Sebastian Bach, the young Sebastian Bach, got wind of this, and he was deeply influenced by some of Vivaldi's early instrumental music. So the importance of Vivaldi, I'm not trying to diminish his own importance as a composer and as obviously an international star eventually, but in 1711 he was quite young, and he probably was not hugely recognizable as a name. And I think that he, as a young and a virtuoso sort of violinist and as a violin teacher, he was obviously a brilliant participant in this whole process. So I also think I want to say something just quickly about Vivaldi, and this is partly this Venetian scene, right? He did not have a courtly patron. He had to maneuver in this world of lots and lots of talented musicians and sophisticated audiences. He was entrepreneurial. He wound his principal job, really for most of his adult life, was not at the Ospedale, but it was at the Teatro Sant'Angelo, where he wrote lots of operas. He was very much involved in opera. But, you might say, but he was a priest, right? He had taken the holy orders. What was he doing writing opera? right? And that is another sort of aspect of this Venetian scene, which I think is significant and worth remembering, that there was this so much of the musical world in Venice straddled the secular and the sacred, right? You would have these musical conventions of opera would be used in oratorio and vice versa, and the nuns, the figlie di coro themselves were using so-called secular musical ideas, but in their church on a Sunday in technically a religious service, a religious performance of some sort. So these porous boundaries, right, that are so much a part of 18th century Venice are very much at the center of the way music, or instrumental music, was being experienced. And I'd just like to suggest that we think about these seductive voices emanating from the balconies of a church on a Sunday morning. And the idea that these performers were living chaste and obedient lives, and yet they achieved fame and in some cases money, sometimes they even were able to bank their own money, in this public-facing, risk-taking world of performance. So, this is uniquely Venetian music, in the sense that it's played by women who had access to uniquely rewarding musical careers. This kind of conservatory situation was absolutely not available to women any place else but Venice, for reasons that I've described. And it was this music was composed by someone who had succeeded within a uniquely Venetian context, manipulating the wealthy nobles as patrons. And I want to say this one more thing. I'm sure many of you have been to Venice, or at least seen images of it. And there is something about Vivaldi's slow movements that feel lagoonish to me. And just think about that. When you get to some of these slow movements, imagine the languid ripples on the lagoon, the light reflecting off it, and perhaps the sort of gentle breezes coming by as we enjoy the beautiful sounds that the violins produce. Thank you.